All right, I will say good morning. Good morning. Let us begin by thanking all of our sponsors for this morning's share. To thank our annual Talmud Torah sponsor, Filsim Shvach Baretz Yisrael, for dedicating the Shurim and Joshos this year as a schos for Besaros Tavos for Am Yisrael. Talmud Torah sponsors for the month of Elul, Haba Alin Latova Bennett Goldberg, for an Aliyah for the Shemus of his parents, Avram ben Asher Pinchas and Thega Rezel Bas Zalig Zichron L'Racha, and in the hopes that the tefillos of our entire Kila and beyond will be answered in Meretz Hashem over these Yamim Nora. Shmuel Silber, the Ilu Nishmas David Flam's father, Rabbi Ari Flam, Yitzchak Aryeh ben Hachava, Rabbi Yaakov Zichron L'Bracha. Let's be hoping in the merit of our Talmud Torah, Kadosh Baruch Hu will bring home all of our hostages. Our holy soldiers will be successful. B'chol Maasei Yedehem. Halabai, we should truly be Zoch in Meretz Hashem, Nisim and Niflaos for all of Klal Yisrael. We'll say today's daf, Maseches Zevachim, is daf Gimel. What a great Zuchos Baruch Hashem to continue along. Continue the journey in this beautiful, beautiful Masechta. We are picking up on Beis Amud Beis 2b, and we left off Ela Meha, which is 2, 4, 6, 8, 10, 12, 14, 15 lines up from the bottom. Elameha. So if you remember again, we're dealing with very interesting sugyas. Just to reorient ourselves for a moment. The Mishnah introduced us to the idea that halacha l'maisa, if a person offers up a korban for the wrong carbonic designation, I have to bring a shlamim and I have in mind for an olah. So the halacha is the korban itself is effective. However, it does not count towards the obligation of the owner. Good. That's the Mishnah's halacha. Obviously, machlokis in terms of some of the details of that halacha, but that's the basic core idea. The Gemara then got into a very interesting question, which is, what happens if a person doesn't have, we'll call it counter das, they just have no das, what we'll call stama. The Gemara calls stama, which means a person offers up a korban without any specific intent. What happens under those circumstances? Halacha l'maisa is what we call stama, right? Stama, just a nondescript intent. Is that like negative intent, or ultimately again, is it like negative intent, or just no, that does not in any way undermine the effectiveness of the korban. So the Gemara went back and forth trying to give a whole bunch of proofs. Nothing has been conclusive up until now. So the Gemara said, let me prove this point from here. I'll say this is actually a very interesting Gemara. L'shem shisha devarim hazevach nizbach. When offering up a korban, this is actually, he quotes over here, this is Daf Mem Bab, so we'll see this in a couple of weeks from now. So the Gemara says, when offering up a korban, you have to have in mind 6 things. Very interesting. What are the 6 things? Number 1, l'shem zevach. The Shem Zevach, now Rashi points out, I'm going to just, if you follow along in Rashi, so Rashi is in the wide lines on the bottom, 4 lines in. The Shem Zevach, the Shem Mashu Hokdash. So the first thing you have to have in mind is what was this korban consecrated for? Meaning, what type of korban is this? That's the first order of business. You have to have specific intent for the type of korban being offered. Next, the Shem Zoveach. The Shem Zoveach, Rashi says, she's kaper bo bailov, v'lo she's kaper bo achar. You have to have in mind that the intended owners will achieve atonement and not have in mind the wrong owners. So for example, if this is Ruvain's korban, and let's say the Kohen has in mind for Shimon, it's not going to work. So that's the Shem Zevach, specific type of korban, the Shem Zoveach for the one who's offering it, the Shem Shem. The shame. Rashi says over here, L'nachas la'kadosh baruch hu sha'amar v'naser tzona. This is beautiful. You have to offer up the korban for the sake of HaKadosh Baruch Hu. What's very beautiful about this? What's very beautiful about this is you say to yourself, well, why else are you bringing the korban? Like in other words, what else is it exactly that you would be doing? So what you see over here, Rabosai, is that what we'll call situational kavanah is not enough. One requires explicit kavanah. What does situational kavanah mean? I'll give you a perfect example. Situational kavanah is pretty much what many of us operate with in many aspects of our Yiddishkeit. So for example, again, a person is really supposed to go ahead and have kavanah for the first pasuk in Kriyas Shema. Explicit kavanah for those. What happens if a person doesn't have explicit kavanah? So the Mishnah Berurah brings down that there's such a thing as situational kavanah, that essentially, since you're involved and you're doing it, so by pashtos, you have kavanah. By karbanos, it's not enough. It's very interesting. By karbanos, you have to have explicit intent that I'm bringing this for HaKadosh Baruch Hu. L'shem. Next, l'shem ishim. Rashi says, "Laktiram v'lo la'asosam sli." So l'shem ishim means that you have to have in mind that the sacrificial parts are going to be fully consumed on the Mizbeach, and not necessarily just, say a person has in mind they're going to roast the sacrificial parts on the Mizbeach. That's not enough. It has to be fully consumed on the Mizbeach. Next, l'shem ishim, for the sake of the fires. Rashi says over here, laktiram. Sorry, that was I said that wrong. So the shem ishim, that's for the sake of the fires. Good. L'shem reach nichoach, l'shem reach, l'shem nichoach. Ultimately, again, you have to have in mind that Allah said it has to be for reach nichoach, a pleasing aroma. Rashi says over the shem reach, lafuke ivarim shetzlan v'helan d'shaveiman. So this once again would come to exclude, let's say, putting something on the Mizbeach for a short amount of time. The reich nichoach comes about when you allow the meat to be fully burned on the Mizbeach. Incredible. So we'll say, and if you happen to be offering up a sin offering, chatas or an asham, you have to have in mind for the specific avera that you are offering it up for. Incredible. So we'll say a very profound Gemara on many different levels. So the Gemara says, Rabbi Yossi, Af mishalo hayabaliba l'shem achas mikol elu kosher. Now we'll say this is very interesting. Now this is a lot of intention to have for karbanos, right? Six things. Rabbi Yossi says something fascinating. Even someone who did not have explicit intent for one of these things, ultimately kosher. Kosher. Why? Shetnai bezdinu, because it's a stipulation of bezdin. What does that mean? Take a quick look at Rashi. Rashi says, Shelo hayabalibo, l'shmo ela stam, v'lo hiskir echad me'ela. So we'll say, in other words, let's say I had stam kavana in one of these areas, meaning I did not have, I was lacking one of the areas of specific intent. And all I did was go ahead and just have nondescript stam kavana. I'm still yotze. Why? Rashi says, Shetnai bezinu, sheyishchitu stam, v'lo yaskiru b'shchutin l'shmo. The Bible say this is fascinating because essentially the Tanai Bezdin essentially says the way Bezdin stipulated it is situational kavana is enough. As long as externally it's clear what it is that you're doing, even if you lack the specific intent, you are still going to be yotzi. And I will say, what's the logic of that? Asnu Bezdin delolema lishmo. Dilma asi lemeimar shelo lishmo. So this is absolutely fascinating. Bezdin actually legislated that when offering a karban, you should not explicitly say the reason you are offering the karban. In other words, when offering the karban, you should not say, Hineni muchan mazuman, lahakriv, karban ola. You shouldn't do that. Why? What are we concerned about? If we mandate too much specificity, we run the risk of what? Someone saying the wrong thing. But if we just understand that there's situational kavanah, then that is going to be enough. Visa laitra stam apostle. This is very interesting. Now, if you assume the nondescript intent is going to go ahead and invalidate a karban, the stam is puzzle, kaimi bezdin umasni milsa de mifsal, could bezdin institute something that inherently invalidates a karban? In other words, you hear what's happening over here? If you say that non-specific intent by definition invalidates a karban, then how could bezdin essentially warrant? How could they mandate non-specific intent, which is exactly what they're doing over here? Rather, what do you see from here? The Gemara says, what you see from here is that halacha l'maisa, stama does not invalidate the karban. So I will say this is a very riveting Gemara because look what the Gemara just did. 6 different things you really have to have in mind when you offer up a karban. And then right afterwards, the Gemara is saying, but by the way, if you're missing any of it, don't worry about it, because it's a Tanai Bezdin. Essentially, Bezdin said, as long as situationally it looks right, you're good to go. Why wouldn't they mandate that when you bring a karban, you are explicit about the karban that you're bringing? Because I will say, be careful what you mandate. Because if you mandate that, a person has to say something, which then means you open up the door for them saying the wrong thing. And if they say the wrong thing, they can really undermine the karban. So, but yet, we see saying nothing doesn't undermine the karban. What does that show you? The non-specific intent, when it comes to karbanos, does not undermine the effectiveness of the karban. Or in other words, using the lingo of the Gemara, stama kosher, which Abba says is fantastic. So therefore, it turns out over here that now we have 2 halachas. Halacha number 1 is if you go ahead and you offer up a karban for the wrong designation. I'm supposed to bring in ola, I have in mind for a shlamim. So halacha l'maisa, what does the Mishnah teach me? Karban is kosher, but does not count towards my obligation. Halacha number 2 is if I have to bring a karban, I bring the right karban, with no specific intent. By the way, in that case, what's the halacha? Not only is the karban kosher, but what? it does count towards my obligation. Stama is kosher. Incredible. Let's go back there. Says the Gemara, never gabe get the stama possible. If remember again, on the top of yesterday's Amid, the Gemara was contrasting the halachos of karbanos with get, and explained that by get, let's say non-specific intent does not work. So the Gemara says, by the way, where do you know that from? Right? Where do you get that from? So the Gemara says, perhaps you'll say from here, Disnan, haya over b'shuk, v'shama sofrim makrin, ish ploni giresh plonis, mimakom ploni. So we'll say what happens. Imagine the following situation. Reuven is married to Rachel, and you know what? Reuven's walking through the shuk, he's walking through the marketplace, and he hears scribes writing a get, and he hears they're announcing it. Reuven from Baltimore is divorcing his wife Rachel from Baltimore. And Reuven says, V'amar, says, my gosh, a sign from HaKadosh Baruch Hu. I was really on the fence. I was on the fence about what to do, but look at this. It's so clear that this is what the Ribbon Shalom wants. It's a get, my name, my wife's name, same city, everything. Pasal Garishbo. Ultimately, again, it doesn't work. So the Gemara says, maybe that's the case of Stama. The Gemara says, no. Don't bring a right from that case. Why that case is different. What do Papa say? Don't Papa. That case is different. Because remember how the Gemara qualifies that case? That was a case of scribal students. I don't know if that's a word, but right, scribal students who, again, were practicing. So when you're practicing, remember again, if there's one thing everyone agrees about a get, is that a get has to be written for the sake of krisos, for the sake of effecting divorce. But it's quite possible over here that in this case, they're writing it for practice. Therefore, again, the get itself is not vested with the power to effect divorce. That's why it doesn't work. Elamiha. Rabbi Shmuel Silber, I'll bring you another ayah. We'll say top of Gimel. Gimel Medalef. 3a. Yes, Rakain. Kasav legarish ishtav and imlach. So also listen to this. Reuven was going to divorce his wife Rachel. And what happened? He decided not to. Matzu ben ira va'amar lo shmi kishmecha v'shem ishti kishem ishtecha. So what happens? Reuven has a friend, Reuven, and that Reuven's wife is also named Rachel. So Reuven number 2 says Reuven number 1, it's shame to let a good get go to waste. So therefore, again, you know what? Why don't I use it for my wife? I'll use it for my wife. The Gemara says, what's the halacha? Pasal garishbo. Ultimately, again, you can't use it. So the Gemara wants to say, what do you see from here? Because non-specific intent for a get doesn't work. To which the Gemara says, no, it's not a raya. Dilma, shiny hasam, the intakle l'shem girishin dahu. No, you can't bring a raya here. Why? Because in this case, that get was specifically written for Reuven 1 and Rachel 1. Once a get is designated for a particular couple, the intik, it is removed from use for any other couple. Rashi says, you look at the second Rashi from the top, the intik, mishar kol hanoshim v'hanoshim l'shem gerishin shalzeh v'shalzeh. So again, this is like the reverse. So once a get is written specifically for a couple, by definition, again, it is precluded for use by anyone else. Fine, next. So remember again, we're just trying to find the case of where the Gemara said that stama by gittin doesn't work. All the Gemara is saying is, tell me where you get that from. Yes, Rakain, more than this, Yesh lo shtei nashim sheshmosei and shavos. So let's listen to this. Reuven has 2 wives, and both of them are named Rachel. Such a bad idea on so many levels, right? The Gemara says, right, he has 2 wives, same name. Kasav legarish es hagdola lo igarish bo saktana. So let's say again he was ready to divorce Rachel number 1. Right? And then he changes his mind. He's like, you know what? No, I'm going to divorce Rachel number 2. So you can't do that. Well, let me put in one more piece of information. He wrote a get for Rachel number 1. And now he decides, you know what? I want to go ahead and divorce Rachel number 2. Now, both say, now again, this case, it's same husband, right? Both wives are named Rachel. All the other information is the same. What's the halacha? You can't do that. So we'll say, so once again, that seems to say that non-specific intent by gittin doesn't work. To which the Gemara says, no, that's not necessarily a fair case. I'll tell you why. Shiny hasam, the intikle l'shem gerishin dahi. Again, same idea as before. Once the get was written for Rachel number 1, by definition, what occurs? It is removed from use for Rachel number 2. So this is not a case of just specific. This is the mechanics of a get. Once a get is written for someone, by definition, it cannot be used for anyone else. Elomiha. Rather from here, Marsa Yesral came, interesting case. Amr l'lavlar, kasuv, ule'ezah she'ertzeh garesh. So listen to this. Reuven goes over to the sofer. And what does he do? Again, same case. Reuven has two wives named Rachel. And Reuven says, listen, to the sofer, he says, listen, I'm divorcing someone, right? Someone's getting divorced today, right? So I'm divorcing someone. So I don't know yet which Rachel I am divorcing. So just do me a favor. Just write Reuven, Rachel, put in all the important information, and I'll see how I'm feeling later, right? In other words, I'll see what's happening later on, and I'll decide which Rachel I'm going to divorce. So the Gemara says, Pasal garishbo. Ultimately, it doesn't work. It doesn't work. Now, before we go on, it sounds like, why doesn't it work? Because again, you have non-specific intent. So this would seem to indicate that non-specific intent by gittin doesn't work. To which, once again, the Gemara says, no, maybe there's a different reason. Dilma shiny hasam, de'ain breira. See, Rabbi say, remember, the issue over there is that case is going to rely on breira. What's breira? Retroactive clarification, right? So at the end of the day, what's that going to require is then, it's going to turn out that when he gives Rachel a get, so the Rachel who he gives the get retroactively becomes clarified that that's the Rachel for whom the get was written. Okay, so that presupposes you rely on Breira, but if you don't rely on Breira, it's not going to work. Elameha. Here we go. Hakosev tov say gittin. Both says, listen to this. Remember, again, back to our gittin days. So there's a tofes and a toref, right? So remember again, the tofes is kind of like the boilerplate part of the get. It's just the pro forma part of the get. That's the same in every single document. Then there's the toref. The toref is the couple-specific information, as well as the line, Hareat muteres l'chol adam. You are permitted to every man. Right? So now the Gemara says, Akol seif tov segin, tzarach shianiach makom ha'ish u'makom ha'isha, makom ha'edim u'makom ha'zman. So Rabbi says, listen to this. Let's say a sofer decides, you know what? I want to get a head start on writing a get takes a little bit of time. So I want to go ahead and just kind of write, I want to pre-write as many as I can. The Gemara says, no problem. So you could write the boilerplate stuff, that's not a problem, but you must leave out the name of the man, the name of the woman, obviously the space for where the Eidim are going to sign, and the date. But it's also, it's the Gemara says, Rabbi Shmuel, also, you have to leave out. So we'll say, what do you see from this? That gittin only work if they are written with specific intent. The fact that you have to leave out the couple specific information indicate to us that a get is only valid if written with specific intent, which then by definition tells us that what? That a get written with non-specific intent, what we call stama, is not going to work. So therefore, we'll say, what we come out with over here is that halacha l'maisa, Karbanas, when offered up stama without specific intent, absolutely working. By the way, not only it works in terms of the karbanas kosher, and it also satisfies the obligation of the owner. At least that's the conclusion that we have right now. By a get that is written without specific intent, totally does not work. Good. Gemara goes weiter. Gemara says as follows. Su Rabbi Milsach Risi. So we'll say, if you remember again how this whole sugya started. Remember again, this is where Ravina said to Rav Papa, oh, did you miss an incredible night? Why? Because again, in the boundary of Beit Karmach, Rava was posing contradictions, answering questions, all this stuff. So the Gemara now is going to go through a couple more of the contradictions that Rava resolved during that evening. Su Rami Mil Sachrisi. So Rava also brought something else up. Miyam Rav Yehuda Rav. So we'll say beforehand, Rav Yehuda, the name of Rav, was quoted as saying as follows: Chatas sheshachta l'shem ola psula, shachta l'shem chulin kshera. All right, so we'll say, so this is fascinating. Rav Yehuda is on record as saying in the name of Rav the following case: that if you shechted a chatas for the shame, with the intention that it was an ola, ultimately, again, we actually didn't see this statement yet. Rashi points out this is on Mem Vavam Beis 46b, so a little bit of time till we get there. But here's the name of Rav, that if you shecht a chatas for the purpose of an ola, which means again I have to bring a carbon chatas. Where again, we'll say, remember again, we know chatas, right? We are experts in chatas from our Horius days. You're like, we learned about chatas and Horius? Yeah, we did actually, right? Only for about 3/4 of the time, right? But the nice, remember again, when you bring a carbon chatas, so any infraction for which, if done intentionally, would have a chi of kares, right? If done b'shoy, if done unintentionally, you bring a carbon chatas. So Ruvain accidentally ate on Yom Kippur, right? And therefore, again, that's kares. If done intentionally, chatas. He brings a chatas. But when he brings his chatas, he has in mind that it's l'shem ola. So what does Rav say? Ultimately, it's possible. That invalidates the carbon. Then it validates the carbon. Now, we'll say, by the way, leave aside the Mishnah, right? Our Mishnah spoke about in general that whenever you play with the chatas, it's going to be invalid, right? Leave that on the side for now, right? So ultimately, again, if you shech the chatas l'shem all is possible, shachta l'shem chulin kshera. Wow, this is interesting. But let's say when you shechted the chatas, you had in mind that it would be l'chulin, right? L'chulin, meaning what? That halacha l'maisa, you had in mind that it's not a carbon. Not a carbon, you're just shechting an animal. What's the halacha? It's kasher. Now, by the way, also I just want to point out, so remember somebody mentioned this after davening yesterday, and I realized I neglected to say this part. When you speak on having different intentions by shchita, one of the things that we will see is, in Yirtzeh Hashem, shchita is kshera bizar. So remember again, in the sacrificial process, a Kohen does not have to be the one who is shechting the carbon. A Yisrael is allowed to do that. So therefore, again, this could be the Kohen having the wrong intentions, but it could also just be simply the owner himself having the wrong intentions. So I'll say, so now what's going on over here? First of all, take a look at Rashi. Actually, no, not yet, sorry. Alma, what do you see from here? This is fascinating. Dimina machriv ba, the lav mina lo machriv ba. Well, so what do you see from here? That it's only when you have erroneous intent that's within the same min, within the same type of intent, does that undermine the carbon. But if you have intent that has nothing to do with the carbon itself, it doesn't undermine. So in other words, what does this mean? If you have in mind the wrong type of carbon, ultimately that undermines the effectiveness of your carbon. But if your das has to do with something that is totally extraneous to carbonos, that does not undermine the effectiveness of the carbon itself, right? So if I'm offering up a chatos and I have in mind for an ola, ultimately, again, the carbon is pasul. But I'm offering up a chatas, and I have in mind for chulin, the carbon is kasher. So the lashon of the Gemara is dimina. It is only a similar type of intention undermines the carbon. A dissimilar type of intention does not undermine the carbon. So what is a similar type of intention? Intention for another carbon. Dissimilar type of intention for chulin. So the Gemara says, okay, that is really interesting, and let's analyze this a little bit. So the Gemara says as follows. If you look at Rashi says, here's the interesting logic. The lav mina, higon chulin. If I'm offering up a carbon chatas and I have in mind for chulin, Rashi says over here, she'eno min kachim. Ultimately, obviously, chulin is not a type of carbon. Lo machriv ba. It does not undermine the effectiveness of the carbon. Why? Ve'ein shmo nitbas al hazevach la'akor shmo mimenu. Why? Because they're both saying, calling a carbon chulin does not in any way dislodge the identity of the carbon. But calling a chatos, an ola, absolutely can dislodge the identity of the carbon. Only a similar type of identity can dislodge the initial identity. A totally dissimilar form of identity cannot dislodge original identity. Fascinating. So let's analyze this. Alma, the love lo machriv ba. The Gemara is a kasha. Supposed to interesting back to get. Kol haget shenichtav shelo l'shem isha pasul. So listen to this. Any get shenichtav shelo l'shem isha, right? That was not written with das for a particular woman is pasul. Okay, right? In other words, that halacha l'maisa. Then again, on a simple level, if Reuben wrote a get to divorce his wife Rachel, and he has another wife Leah, he can't use that get to divorce Leah. The Gemara says, listen to this, Vafilu l'shem ovedes kochavim. Nami pasal, right? Nami pasal v'shani. So the Gemara says, even for an avodas kochav. Now, what does this mean? That halacha l'maisa, even if Reuben went ahead, we'll give Rashi just a moment. Vafilu l'shem avodas kochavim. Daha shelo l'shem isha katani demashma shelo l'shem isha zu elo l'shem isha acheres kolduhu. The apagav da'avodas kochavim lav bas gerishin hi mahanya lifsal. So we'll say, what does this mean? That halacha l'maisa, again, if you wrote a get for one woman but had in mind for a different woman, it undermines the effectiveness of the get, even if the other woman was an avodas kochavim, not Jewish. Now we'll say, now a non-Jewish woman has no shaychus to gittin. No shaychus to gittin. So again, what do you see from here? You see from here that halacha l'maisa, even intention for something that has nothing to do with the subject at hand, can derail the process. The Gemara says, get dal avodas kochavim mina. No. Take out avodas kochavim from this case. Havile stama. Because again, remember, a get for an avodas kochavim is no different than non-specific intent. And as we just went ahead and saw, stam apostle, non-specific intent by gittin ultimately undermines the effectiveness of the get. Kachim, on the other hand, kachim dal chulin minayhu havalei stama. By kachim, if you remove the chulin designation, what do you have? You have just non-specific intent. Ustama ksherim, and ultimately, again, stama is always kosher. Shabbos says, this is very interesting. So the Gemara wants to suggest the following. The reason ultimately, again, why, if I have a carbon, I have to bring a chatas, and I have in mind for chulin, which, by the way, I don't know, before I saw this Gemara, I would have thought that's incredibly severe. And I would have thought that, of course, that undermines the entire effectiveness of the carbon. Kamash Shmuel Rav says, it doesn't. What's the logic behind it? The logic behind it is repurposing a carbon as chulin ultimately, again, is meaningless. Why is it meaningless? Because it can't be done. Because, again, you can't go ahead and swap out a carbonic identity for a non-carbonic identity. Therefore, again, offering it up l'shem chulin or shechting l'shem chulin is no worse than non-specific intent. And what do we just show? The non-specific intent by karbanos doesn't invalidate the carbon. However, again, if you think about it using that logic, if I'm a chatas and I'm now offering up for an ola, okay, that's different. Why? Because again, these are similar identities, similar in that they're both carbonic identities, and that can undermine the effectiveness of the carbon. Incredible. For Rami Mel Sachrisi, we'll bring up another kasha. Chatas sheshachta l'shem ola psula, shachta l'shem chulin kshera. Did Rav really say this? That if I have a chatas and I shechted it for the purpose of an ola, ultimately the carbon is ineffective, but it's possible. But if I shechted the shem chulin is kasher, Alma, what do you see from the same principle? The mina machriv ba, the lo mina lo machriv ba. Now, say, what do you see from here? That it is only ultimately, again, what we'll call a similar intention that undermines the carbon. The min has to be the same type of intention, meaning substituting one carbonic identity for another. That's what undermines. The lo mina, but substituting an identity that has nothing to do with carbonos, ultimately does not undermine the carbon. The Gemara says, Ayva Tanya, but we learned, so we'll say, okay, get ready for this. Now, tuma and tara. And we'll say, by the way, just understand the incredible privilege that we have right now. Right? You have carbonos and tuma and tara, literally again on the same page. Two topics, usually that when we see them, what's our innate reaction? Our innate reaction, when is this over, right? When is this over? So I will say this is a golden opportunity to redeem ourselves and to redeem our learning by throwing ourselves fully into this right now. We can affect such a dramatic turnaround in the way we often view two pretty difficult topics. Carbon we've got. Get ready for Tumantara. Here we go. Tocho, velo toch, tocho. So this is really fascinating. We'll say, what's the halacha by kli cheres? What's the halacha by kli cheres? Earthenware vessel. I have no idea. Okay, good. So I'd be out of a job, right? So the Gemara says like this. So the Gemara says, what's the halacha with kli cheres? Kli cheres, it becomes tamei from the inside, mitocho. In other words, if you put a sheretz, you slap a sheretz on the outside of an earthenware vessel, the earthenware vessel does not become tamei. If you dangle a sheretz in the airspace of the earthenware vessel, even if it doesn't touch anything, the earthenware vessel becomes tamei. Now, both say, interestingly enough, that halacha only applies to something that is dangled inside of the kli cheres. But let's say you have something else that's inside of the kli cheres, that item will not become tamei. Okay, so we're going to explain this in just a moment. So the Gemara says, look at Rashi, tocho. Rashi says, almost right across. Kol kli cheres, kol kli cheres, the lo toch tocho. Kli hamunach betanor, upiv lemala min piatanor, va'ochlin umashkin besocho, v'sheretz betanor, ochlin shebekelim tahorin. So we'll say now, so let's illustrate in the following case. Easiest way to illustrate it. You have an earthenware oven. Okay. Now inside of that earthenware oven is another utensil. The opening of the utensil extends out of them, because remember, again, I will say, their ovens didn't open like from the side, like we have it. Their ovens had openings on the top. So imagine you have an earthenware oven, or earthenware utensil. There's another utensil sitting inside of that oven. The opening of that secondary utensil extends outside of the oven. There's, let's say, food inside of that secondary utensil. Okay, following me so far? Now what happens? there's a dead sheretz inside of the oven. So what's the halacha? Anything inside of the oven is now tameh. But interestingly enough, anything inside of that interior utensil is tahar. Is tahar. Why? Because essentially, a kli cheres, a sheretz and a kli cheres is only metame that which is inside of the kli cheres. But that which is inside of another kli in the kli cheres is impervious ultimately again to the tumah. That's what we call tocho, v'lo tocho. Only inside of the kli cheres. But if the food item is inside of another utensil inside of the kli cheres, ultimately, again, the items in the secondary utensil do not become tamei. Now, I will say, remember, the caveat on this is it has to be that the opening of the second utensil extends outside of the oven, right? Because if the opening of the secondary utensil is open inside the oven, everything will become tamei. Okay. V'atanya tocho v'lo socho afilu kli shetef matzah. I must say, this is not only, by the way, with another earthenware utensil. Interestingly enough, it actually doesn't matter what the second utensil is made of. It makes absolutely no difference. Halacha l'maisa, the contents of that second utensil, which is inside of the oven, inside of the kli cheres, does not contract tumah. Rashi says, "Vav klilu kli shetef matzil kolomar lomi bay kli cheres hamunach betanor the matzil ala ochlin shebesocho the ha toch tocho hi ukli gufei lekal mered mitame ba'aver v'yitma ochlin shebo they kli cheres mitame megavo ela afilu kli shetef shitame megabo." So I'll say, listen to this. Okay, so let me just clarify this once more, right? So let's go with what we know. You have an oven. The oven is a kli cheres. There's a dead sheretz inside of the oven, even if it doesn't touch any of the interior walls of the oven. What's the halacha? What's the halacha? Everything inside of the kli cheres is tamei. What's the halacha of tocho? The halacha of tocho says that halacha l'maisa, if you have another kli inside of the oven, and there's food ultimately again inside of that secondary kli, the food inside of the second kli does not become tamei because of the sheretz in the oven. Because what's the halacha? Because again, sheretz inside of a kli cheres will only mean tamei tocho, that which is in the oven, but not tocho. Not saying that it's something else. Now, both say, now the Gemara says that halacha applies no matter what the material of the second utensil is. Because I would have thought like this. The truth is, if you think about it, it's not such a big chiddush. Why? Because halacha l'maisa, the food inside of the secondary kli cheres only becomes tamei from the interior. So as long as the opening of the second utensil extends out of the oven, you're good to go, right? Because the kli cheres can't become tamei out of the exterior. What if it's a metal utensil or some other material that does contract tumah even just through exterior contact? Even then, the halacha is that anything inside of that secondary utensil does not contract tumah. Incredible. So the Gemara says as follows: Shetef literally means something that's washed. Something that's washed. Okay, it's matzil. The Gemara says, listen to this. The Gemara says, "V'shani asu chulin eitzel kachim kimechitza eitzel tanor." And ultimately, again, we learned. Listen to this: that chulin by kachim is like a mechitza by an oven. Okay, what does that mean? So we'll say, "Ma mechitza eitzel tanor lo mahanya laklal." So I'll say, listen to this. Just like a mechitza inside of an oven. Now, what does that mean? So I'll say, imagine the same case. You have a tanor. You have an oven. Inside of the oven, you have a sheretz. Or before you even put the sheretz there, what do? You put a mechitza in the oven. Put a mechitza in the oven. It's a from house. You put a mechitza in the oven. Chalit mixed dancing, right? So nice again, right? So you go ahead, you put a mechitza in the oven. So I'll say, interestingly enough, so let's say the sheretz is on one side of the mechitza, and let's say there's another food item on the other side of the mechitza. The mechitza does not help at all. Doesn't help at all. Anything inside of the oven ultimately again becomes tamei. So the Gemara says, just like a mechitza in an oven doesn't help, so too calling a karban chulin doesn't do anything to the carbon either. That's what the Gemara is comparing it to. So the Gemara says, this not, because we learned, so if you have an oven, and let's say you put a mechitza in the oven, either boards or curtains, and the sheretz is on one side of the mechitza, and then let's say again there's food or other items on the other side of the mechitza, what's the halacha? Hakol tamei. Ultimately, again, everything is tamei. In other words, the mechitza does not do anything. So the Gemara says, Kavera shepechusa. Shipachusa. So let's say karas literally means, karas usually means like a beehive. In this context, it actually means like a basket that looks like a beehive and that has openings in it. Upakak upakuka bekash. And you plugged up the openings with straw. Umishuleshes la'avir hatanor, and it's suspended into the airspace of the tanor. Sheretz bisocha. Sheretz bisocha, and there's a sheretz inside of the tanor. Hatanor tamei, sheretz betanor ochlin shebesocha tmein. Good. Rabbi Elazar ben Tar, Rabbi Elazar ultimately again says it's tar. Now, what's Rabbi Elazar's logic? So the Gemara says, what's Rabbi Elazar's logic? Rabbi Elazar says, Rabbi Elazar kavachomer im hitzil b'meis hachamer. Rabbi Elazar says, of course a mechitza in an oven is going to work. Why would a mechitza in an oven work? So listen to his kavachomer. Im hitzil b'meis hachamer lo tatza b'kli cheres hakal. So it says, listen to this. If a mechitza works by tumas meis. Now, where does a mechitza work by tumas meis? If you have a person who died in a house, right, and you have a partition in front of that meis, ultimately, again, that prevents the tumah from spreading. So, if mechitza works to block tumas meis, right, which is much more chamer, why wouldn't it work in an oven to prevent the spread of tumas sheretz? Amrullah, they said to him, "Lo, that's not a good kavachomer. Why? Im hitzil b'meis chamer shekein chaluka ba'olin tatzah b'kli cheres akal shein chaluka ba'olin." It's very different. Everything has to do with where it makes sense to have a mechitza. People put partitions in homes, right? They put partitions in homes. So mechitza belongs in a home. So because a mechitza belongs in a home, therefore it works. A mechitza in an oven doesn't belong there. Because it doesn't belong, therefore what? Therefore it will not work in any way to block tumah. So the Gemara says, Hatinach Rabbanan. So this makes sense, ultimately, again, according to the Rabbanan. Ultimately, Rashi says, "Damri mechitza lo matzla, isla drav damar lab mina lo machras." So now listen to this. So according to the Rabbanan, now watch this. According to the Rabbanan who say that in an oven, a mechitza doesn't do anything. Why doesn't the mechitza do anything? Why doesn't the mechitza block the flow of sheretz to in the oven? Why not? Because at the end of the day, a mechitza doesn't belong in the oven. Right? Mechitza doesn't do in the oven. Same logic, Rabbanan will say that if you call a carbon chulin, what does that chulin designation do? What does it do? Nothing. Why? Because carbon has no sheikhus to chulin. So this makes a lot of sense. There's a lot of symmetry in the shitas. The Gemara says, however, Rabbi Elazar, ma'ikal meimar. But according to Rabbi Elazar, what is this? Rabbi Elazar says that a mechitza by an oven will work. So it's interesting. The Gemara is suggesting that the same Rabbi Elazar says that a mechitza in an oven would work. So too we should say that what? That calling a carbon chulin should also undermine the carbon. To which the Gemara says, no. The Gemara says, Michael Limar, Rabbi Elazar kavachomer kamer. No, we just said before, Rabbi Eliezer, was advancing a kavachomer. Ehachi hasam nami lema kavachomer. So you can say the same thing of a kavachomer by the karbanos. What's the kavachomer by karbanos? The Gemara will say. So the Gemara says, hasam nami lema kavachomer. Kachim mechalim. Well, so we'll just do this last time. We're going to stop. Kachim mechalim. So the Gemara says, Kachim mechalalin, kachim, chulin lo kol shekein. And we'll say if halacha l'maisa, so ultimately again calling a carbon a wrong name has the ability to undermine the carbon. So certainly again calling the carbon chulin will certainly go ahead and undermine the carbon. Ella. Time of the Rav Rabbi Elazar. We'll say no. We'll stop over here for today. All right, this is not a good way to start the Masechta. Okay, good. Slichas, right? Okay, we'll say good. We're fine. It gets short. We'll say great. We'll say, but again, Vakers, you see how beautiful this Gemara is. We can follow it. We got this. We'll catch up before Shabbos. Shkayach, everyone. Oh, perfect. Thank you. Oh, good morning. Sure.